decided to go ahead. He named MacNaughton the Queen's envoy to Kabul, the Afghan capital, the top British representative in Afghanistan. Meeting little resistance along the way, in August 1839, the British army reached Kabul. Dost Muhammad fled to the mountains, and the Shah re-entered the city. To the local inhabitants, this was a strange sight. Shah Shuja, whom many could barely remember, looked old and submissive alongside MacNaughton, who rode into Kabul wearing a bright-colored uniform, topped by a cocked hat fringed with ostrich feathers. Why had these people come? What were they doing here? With the Shah back in power, MacNaughton had to reassess the situation. Reports came in informing him that Dost Muhammad was building an army in the mountains to the north. Meanwhile, to the south, it seemed that in invading the country, the British had insulted some local chieftains by plundering their lands for food. These chiefs were now stirring up trouble. It was also clear that the Shah was unpopular with his former subjects, so unpopular that MacNaughton could not leave him and other British interests in the country unprotected. Reluctantly, MacNaughton ordered most of the British army to remain in Afghanistan until the situation was stabilized. Time went by, and eventually, MacNaughton decided to allow the officers and soldiers of this increasingly long-standing occupying force to send for their families, so that life would be less harsh for them. Soon the wives and children came, along with their Indian servants. But where MacNaughton had imagined that the arrival of the soldiers' families would have a humanizing, civilizing effect, it only alarmed the Afghans. Were the British planning a permanent occupation? Everywhere the local people looked, there were representatives of British interests, talking loudly in the streets, drinking wine, attending theaters and horse races. Strange imported pleasures that they had introduced to the country. Now their families were making themselves at home. A hatred of everything English began to take root. There were those who warned MacNaughton about this, and to all of them he had the same answer. Everything would be forgotten and forgiven when the army left Afghanistan. The Afghans were childlike, emotional people. Once they felt the benefits of English civilization, they would be more than grateful. One matter, however, did worry the envoy. The British government was unhappy about the increasing expense of the occupation. MacNaughton would have to do something to cut costs, and he knew just where to begin. Most of the mountain passes, through which Afghanistan's main trade routes ran, were held by the Gilji tribes, who for many years, over the lives of many different rulers of the country, had been paid a stipend to keep the passes open. MacNaughton decided to have this stipend. The Giljis responded by blocking the passes, and elsewhere in the country, tribes sympathetic to the Giljis rebelled. MacNaughton, caught off guard, tried to put these rebellions down, but he did not take them too seriously, and worried officers who told him to respond more vigorously were rebuked for overreacting. Now the British Army would have to stay indefinitely. The situation deteriorated quickly. In October 1841, a mob attacked the home of a British official and killed him. In Kabul, local chiefs began to conspire to expel their British overlords. Shah Shuja panicked. For months, he had begged MacNaughton to let him capture and kill his main rivals, an Afghan ruler's traditional method of securing his position. MacNaughton had told him that a civilized country did not use murder to solve its political problems. The Shah knew that the Afghans respected strength and authority, not civilized values. To them, his failure to deal with his enemies made him look weak and unruler-like and left him surrounded by enemies. MacNaughton would not listen. The rebellion spread, and MacNaughton now had to confront the fact that he did not have the manpower to put down a general uprising. But why should he panic? The Afghans and their leaders were naive. He would regain the upper hand through intrigue and cleverness. To that end, MacNaughton publicly negotiated an agreement whereby British troops and citizens would leave Afghanistan, in exchange for which the Afghans would supply the retreating British with food. Privately, though, MacNaughton made it known to a few key chiefs that he was willing to make one of them the country's vizier and load him with money, in exchange for putting down the rebellion and allowing the English to stay. The chief of the Eastern Gilgis, Akbar Khan, responded to this offer, and on December 23, 1841, MacNaughton rode out for a private meeting with him to seal the bargain. After exchanging greetings, Akbar asked MacNaughton if he wanted to go ahead with the treachery they were planning. Thrilled to have turned the situation around, MacNaughton cheerily answered that he did. Without a word of explanation, Akbar signaled his men to grab MacNaughton and throw him in prison. He had no intention of betraying the other chiefs. Along the way, a mob developed, caught hold of the unfortunate envoy, and with a fury built up over years of humiliation, literally tore him to pieces. His limbs and head were paraded through the streets of Kabul, and his torso was hung from a meat hook in the bazaar. In a matter of days, everything unraveled. The remaining British troops, some 4,500 of them, along with 12,000 camp followers, were forced to agree to an immediate retreat from Afghanistan despite the bitter winter weather. The Afghans were to keep the retreating army supplied, but did not do so. Certain that the British would never leave unless forced to, they harassed them relentlessly in their retreat. Civilians and soldiers alike quickly perished in the snow. On January 13th, British forces at the fort in Jalalabad saw a single horse struggling toward the gates. Its half-dead rider, Dr. William Bryden, was the sole survivor of the British Army's doomed invasion of Afghanistan. Interpretation. The knowledge that would have averted the catastrophe was at MacNaughton's fingertips long before he launched the expedition. Englishmen and Indians who had lived in Afghanistan could have told him that the Afghan people were among the proudest and most independent on the planet. To them, the image of foreign troops marching into Kabul would constitute an unforgivable humiliation. On top of that, they were not a people yearning for peace, prosperity, and reconciliation. In fact, they saw strife and confrontation as a healthy way of life. MacNaughton had the information, but refused to see it. Instead, he projected onto the Afghans the values of an Englishman, which he mistakenly assumed were universal. Blinded by narcissism, he misread every signal along the way. As a result, his strategic moves, leaving the British Army occupying Kabul, having the Gilgis' stipend, trying not to overplay his hand in putting down the rebellions, were exactly the opposite of what was needed. And on that fateful day when he literally lost his head, he made the ultimate miscalculation, imagining that money and an appeal to self-interest would buy loyalty among the very people he had so humiliated. Blindness and narcissism like this are not so rare. We find them every day. Our natural tendency is to see other people as mere reflections of our own desires and values. Failing to understand the ways they are not like us, we are surprised when they do not respond as we had imagined. We unintentionally offend and alienate people, then blame them, not our inability to understand them, for the damage done. Understand, if you let narcissism act as a screen between you and other people, you will misread them, and your strategies will misfire. You must be aware of this and struggle to see others dispassionately. Every individual is like an alien culture. You must get inside his or her way of thinking, not as an exercise in sensitivity, but out of strategic necessity. Only by knowing your enemies can you ever hope to vanquish them. From 6 Secret Teachings by Taigung. Be submissive so that he will trust you, and you will thereby learn about his true situation. Accept his ideas and respond to his affairs as if they were twins. Once you have learned everything, subtly gather in his power. Thus, when the ultimate day arrives, it will seem as if heaven itself destroyed him. The Close Embrace. In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte humiliated the Austrians in the battles of Ulm and Austerlitz. In the subsequent treaty, he carved up the Austrian Empire, taking over its lands in Italy and Germany. For Napoleon, all this was part of a chess game. His ultimate goal was to make Austria an ally, a weak and subordinate ally, but one that would lend him weight in the courts of Europe, since Austria had been a central force in European politics. As part of this overall strategy, Napoleon requested a new Austrian ambassador to France, Prince Clemens von Metternich, at the time the Austrian ambassador to the Prussian court in Berlin. Metternich, then 32, came from one of Europe's most illustrious families. A speaker of impeccable French, a staunch conservative in politics, he was a paragon of breeding and elegance and an inveterate ladies' man. The presence of this polished aristocrat would add a sheen to the imperial court that Napoleon was creating. More important, winning over a man of such power, and Napoleon could be quite seductive in private meetings, would help in his grand strategy of making Austria a weak satellite. And Metternich's weakness for women would give Napoleon a way in. The two men met for the first time in August 1806, when Metternich presented his credentials. Napoleon acted coolly. He dressed well for the occasion, but kept his hat on, which in the mores of the time was rather rude. After Metternich's speech, short and ceremonious, Napoleon began to pace the room and talk politics in a way that made it clear he was in command. He liked to stand up to talk to people while they remained seated. He made a show of speaking pointedly and concisely. He was not some Corsican rube for the sophisticated Metternich to play with. In the end, he was sure he had made the impression he wanted. Over the months to come, Napoleon and Metternich had many more such meetings. It was the emperor's plan to charm the prince, but the charm ran inescapably the other way. Metternich had a way of listening attentively, making apt comments, even complimenting Napoleon on his strategic insights. At these moments, Napoleon would beam inside. Here was a man who could truly appreciate his genius. He began to crave Metternich's presence, and their discussions of European politics became more and more frank. The two became friends of sorts. Hoping to take advantage of Metternich's weakness for women, Napoleon set up his sister, Caroline Murat, to have an affair with the prince. He learned from her a few pieces of diplomatic gossip, and she told him that Metternich had come to respect him. In turn, she also told Metternich that Napoleon was unhappy with his wife, Empress Josephine, who could not bear children. He was considering divorce. Napoleon did not seem upset that Metternich knew such things about his personal life. In 1809, seeking revenge for its ignominious defeat at Austerlitz, Austria declared war on France. Napoleon only welcomed this event, which gave him a chance to beat the Austrians still more soundly than before. The war was hard fought, but the French prevailed, and Napoleon imposed a humiliating settlement, annexing whole sections of the Austrian Empire. Austria's military was dismantled, its government was overhauled, and Napoleon's friend Metternich was named foreign minister, exactly where Napoleon wanted him. Several months later, something happened that caught Napoleon slightly off guard, but delighted him. The Austrian emperor offered him his eldest daughter, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, in marriage. Napoleon knew that the Austrian aristocracy hated him. This had to be Metternich's work. Alliance by marriage with Austria would be a strategic tour de force, and Napoleon happily accepted the offer, first divorcing Josephine, then marrying Marie-Louise in 1810. Metternich accompanied the Archduchess to Paris for the wedding, and now his relationship with Napoleon grew still warmer. Napoleon's marriage made him a member of one of Europe's greatest families, and to a Corsican, family was everything. He had won a dynastic legitimacy he had long craved. In conversation with the prince, he opened up even more than before. He was also delighted with his new empress, who revealed a keen political mind. He let her in on his plans for empire in Europe. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. Now Metternich came to him with a request: the formation of an army of 30,000 Austrian soldiers at Napoleon's disposal. In return, Napoleon would let Austria rebuild its military. Napoleon saw no harm in this step. He was allied with Austria by marriage, and rearmament there would help him in the end. Months later, the Russian invasion had turned into a disaster, and Napoleon was forced to retreat, his army decimated. Now Metternich offered his services as a mediator between France and the other European powers. Centrally placed as it is, Austria had performed that task in the past, and anyway, Napoleon had little choice. He needed time to recoup. Even if Austria's role as a mediator allowed it to reassert its independence, he had little to fear from his in-laws. By the spring of 1813, negotiations had broken down, and a new war was about to break out between the badly damaged France and a powerful alliance of Russia, Prussia, England, and Sweden. By this time, the Austrian army had grown considerably. Somehow, Napoleon had to get his hands on it, but his spies reported that Metternich had entered into secret agreement with the Allies. Surely this had to be some sort of ploy. How could the Austrian emperor fight his son-in-law? Yet in a few weeks it became official. Unless France negotiated a peace, Austria would drop its mediating position and join the Allies. Napoleon could not believe what he was hearing. He traveled to Dresden for a meeting with Metternich, which took place on June 26th. The moment he saw the prince, he felt a shock. The friendly, nonchalant air was gone. In a rather cold tone, Metternich informed him that France must accept a settlement that would reduce it to its natural boundaries. Austria was obligated to defend its interests and the stability of Europe. Suddenly it occurred to the emperor. Metternich had been playing him all along. The family ties merely a ploy to blind him to Austrian rearmament and independence. So I have perpetrated a very stupid piece of folly in marrying an Archduchess of Austria? Napoleon blurted out. Since your Majesty desires to know my opinion, Metternich replied, I will candidly say that Napoleon, the conqueror, has made a mistake. Napoleon refused to accept Metternich's dictated peace. In return, Austria dropped its neutrality and joined the Allies, becoming their de facto military leader. And with Austria leading the way, they finally defeated Napoleon in April 1814 and exiled him to the Mediterranean island of Elba. Interpretation. Napoleon prided himself on his ability to gauge people's psychology and use it against them, but in this case, he was outwitted by a man far superior at such a game. Metternich's modus operandi was the following. He would quietly study his enemies from behind his smiling, elegant exterior, his own apparent relaxation inviting them to open up. In his very first meeting with Napoleon, he saw a man straining to impress. He noticed that the Bantam Napoleon walked on his toes to look taller and struggled to suppress his Corsican accent. Later meetings only confirmed Metternich's impression of a man who craved acceptance as the social equal of Europe's aristocracy. The emperor was insecure. This insight won. Metternich used it to craft the perfect counter-strategy, the offer of marriage into the Austrian dynasty. To a Corsican, that would mean everything, and it would blind Napoleon to a simple reality. For aristocrats like Metternich and the Austrian emperor, family ties meant nothing compared to the survival of the dynasty itself. Metternich's genius was to recognize the appropriate target for his strategy. Not Napoleon's armies, which Austria could not hope to defeat. Napoleon was a general for the ages. But Napoleon's mind. The prince understood that even the most powerful of men remains human and has human weaknesses. By entering Napoleon's private life, being deferential and subordinate, Metternich could find his weaknesses and hurt him as no army could. By getting closer to him emotionally, through the emperor's sister Caroline, through the Archduchess Marie-Louise, through their convivial meetings, he could choke him in a friendly embrace. Understand, your real enemy is your opponent's mind. His armies, his resources, his intelligence can all be overcome if you can fathom his weakness, the emotional blind spot through which you can deceive, distract, and manipulate him. The most powerful army in the world can be beaten by unhinging the mind of its leader. And the best way to find the leader's weaknesses is not through spies, but through the close embrace. Being a friendly, even subservient front, you can observe your enemies, get them to open up and reveal themselves. Get inside their skin. Think as they think. Once you discover their vulnerability, an uncontrollable temper, a weakness for the opposite sex, a gnawing insecurity, you have the material to destroy them. By Karl von Clausewitz. War is not an act of the will aimed at inanimate matter, as it is in the mechanical arts. Rather, it is an act of the will aimed at a living entity that reacts. Keys to warfare. The greatest power you could have in life would come neither from limitless resources nor even consummate skill in strategy. It would come from a clear knowledge of those around you, the ability to read people like a book. Given that knowledge, you could distinguish friend from foe, smoking out snakes in the grass. You could anticipate your enemy's malice, pierce their strategies, and take defensive action. Their transparency would reveal to you the emotions they could least control. Armed with that knowledge, you could make them tumble into traps and destroy them. This kind of knowledge has been a military goal since the dawn of history. That is why the arts of intelligence gathering and spying were invented. But spies are unreliable. They filter information through their own preconceptions and prejudices, and since their trade places them precisely between one side and the other and forces them to be independent operators, they are notoriously hard to control and can turn against you. Then, too, the nuances that give people away, the tone in a speaker's voice, the look in his or her eyes, are inevitably missing from their reports. In the end, the spy's information means nothing unless you are adept at interpreting human behavior and psychology. Without that skill, you will see in it what you want to see, confirming your own prejudices. The leaders who have made best use of intelligence, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Prince Metternich, Winston Churchill, Lyndon Johnson during his career in the U.S. Senate, were all first and foremost great students of human nature and superior readers of men. They honed their skills through personal observation of people. Only with that foundation could the use of spies extend their powers of vision. The first step in the process is to get over the idea that people are impenetrable mysteries and that only some trick will let you peek into their souls. If they seem mysterious, it is because almost all of us learn to disguise our true feelings and intentions from an early age. If we went around showing just how we felt and telling people what we planned to do, we would make ourselves vulnerable to malice. And if we always spoke our minds, we would offend a lot of people unnecessarily. So as we grow up, concealing much of what we are thinking becomes second nature. This deliberate opacity makes the intelligence game difficult, but not impossible. For even as people consciously struggle to conceal what is going on in their minds, they unconsciously want to reveal themselves. Hiding how we feel in social situations is exhausting. Being able to show ourselves is a relief. We secretly want people to know us, even including our dark side. Even while we consciously struggle to control this hidden yearning, unconsciously, we are always sending out signals that reveal a part of what is going on inside. Slips of the tongue, tones of voice, styles of dress, nervous twitches, sudden irrational actions, a look in the eye that contradicts our words, the things we say after a drink. Understand, day in and day out, people emit signals that reveal their intentions and deepest desires. If we do not pick them up, it is because we are not paying attention. The reason for this is simple. We are usually locked up in our own worlds, listening to our internal monologues, obsessed with ourselves and with satisfying our own egos. Like William McNaughton, we tend to see other people merely as reflections of ourselves. To the extent that you can drop your self-interest and see people for who they are, divorced from your desires, you will become more sensitive to their signals. The ability to read people was a critical survival skill for Japanese samurai and was particularly emphasized by the Shinkage school of swordsmanship. One of the school's earliest masters was the 17th century samurai Yagyu Munenori. One spring afternoon in his later years, Munenori was taking a peaceful walk through his gardens, admiring the cherry blossoms. He was accompanied by a page protector who walked behind him, sword raised, as was the custom. Suddenly, Munenori stopped in his tracks. He had a feeling of danger. Looking around, he saw nothing to warrant this feeling, but even so, he was so troubled that he returned to his house and sat with his back against a post to prevent a surprise attack. After Munenori had sat there for a while, his page asked him what was the matter. The samurai confessed that while looking at the cherry blossoms, he had had an intimation of imminent danger, of an enemy on the attack. What troubled him now was that the danger had apparently been imaginary. He must have hallucinated it. A samurai depended on his keen instincts to anticipate attack. If Munenori had lost that power, his life as a warrior was over. Suddenly, the page threw himself to the ground and confessed. As Munenori walked in the garden, the thought had come to the page that if he were to strike at his master while the samurai was lost in admiration of the cherry blossoms, not even this gifted swordsman could have parried his attack. Munenori had not lost his skill at all. Quite the contrary. His incomparable sensitivity to other people's emotions and thoughts had allowed him to pick up sensations from someone behind his back, rather as a horse senses the energy of its rider, or a dog the movements of its owner. An animal has that sensitivity because it pays complete attention. Similarly, the Shinkage school taught warriors to empty their minds, centering themselves in the moment as animals did, and keeping themselves from getting derailed by any particular thought. This would allow the Shinkage warrior to read in his opponent's elbow or hand the slight tension that signaled an attack. He could look through his opponent's eyes and sense the coming blow, or notice the nervous shuffle of the feet that indicated fear or confusion. A master like Munenori could virtually read someone's thoughts when the other person wasn't even visible. The power taught by the Shinkage school, the same power possessed by Prince Metternich, was the ability to let go of one's ego, to submerge oneself temporarily in the other person's mind. You will be amazed at how much you can pick up about people if you can shut off your incessant interior monologue, empty your thoughts, and anchor yourself in the moment. The details you now see give you unfiltered information from which you can put together an accurate picture of people's weaknesses and desires. Be particularly attentive to their eyes. It takes a lot of effort to hide the eye's message about a person's state of mind. According to the baseball pitcher Bob Lemon, the great player Ted Williams was the only hitter who you felt saw through you. In the struggle between pitcher and batter, the pitcher has the advantage of knowing what pitch he will throw. The hitter can only guess at that, which is why even the best of them usually connect only 1 out of every 3 or 4 times. Somehow, Williams changed those odds. Williams' method wasn't magic or even intuition. It was simple enough. He made baseball pitchers his study, watching their patterns over the course of a game, a season, a career. He would ask the pitchers on his own team endless questions about their process, trying to get a feel for how they thought. At the plate, he would empty his mind of everything but the pitcher, noticing the slightest hitch in his wind-up or change in his grip, anything that would signal his intentions. The end result seemed uncanny. At bat, Williams was able to think himself into the pitcher's mind and anticipate the pitch that was coming. Sometimes he would even see himself as another person. a pitcher trying to outwit the great hitter Ted Williams. As Williams demonstrates, the ability to mimic and get inside your enemy's thought patterns depends on collecting as much information on them as you can, analyzing their past behavior for its habitual patterns, and being alert to the signs they give off in the present. It is, of course, critical that people be unaware you are watching them so closely. A friendly front, like Prince Metternich's to Napoleon, will help disguise what you're doing. Do not ask too many questions. The trick is to get people to relax and open up without prodding, shadowing them so quietly that they never guess what you're really up to. Information is useless unless you know how to interpret it, how to use it to tell appearance from reality. You must learn how to recognize a range of psychological types. Be alert, for instance, to the phenomenon of the masked opposite. When someone strikingly manifests a particular personality trait, that trait may well be a